Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ashley Kennedy Shelton, and I am the Vice President of Programs for the Louisiana Disaster Recovery Foundation. And I want to begin by thanking Jody Epstein for all of her hard work in putting this panel together and bringing together this very thoughtful API session. So much gratitude to you. You know, this session is really focused on kind of lessons from the Gulf and really zeroing in on how do you sustain political will around very critical issues in this country. And I think, well, and in particular poverty. I think we saw after Hurricanes Katrina and Rita in Louisiana and much of the Gulf Coast that for a year we were able to sustain some political will and public attention, but very soon thereafter that waned. And even in the wisdom of Spotlight putting together this session, I'm thinking about, you know, a session on the Gulf Coast and being able to attract media and attention, that a session on the Gulf Coast and maintaining political will would be a little difficult to get media here. And so today we have with us two very dynamic women in a very engaging format. And the first person that I will introduce is Angela Glover Blackwell, in whom I've had the pleasure of both working for and working with. And I work in Louisiana around this disaster and its recovery. And Angela is the CEO and founder of PolicyLink. And PolicyLink, in my own work with them, has been engaged in the Gulf Coast for the last 3 years, trying to ensure that those that were impacted by the hurricanes had the right to participate in the decision-making processes that were impacting their lives. And then certainly has a much larger repertoire of national work that is very compelling and really helping to create equitable development around this country. And so we're very pleased to have Angela with us today.
Thank you. Happy to be here, Ashley.
We also have with us Gloria Johnson-Cusack, and she is the Senior Vice President of GMMB, which is a local a national communications firm, but they just so happen to be based here in DC. And I've also had the pleasure of meeting and talking with Gloria about this very issue. I mean, we were here 2 weeks ago. Time flies, but we were here 2 weeks ago and really sat down to say that as these presidential elections occur and the next president's first 100 days, you know, how do we make the Gulf Coast of particular interest to the next president, and how do we ensure that people know that the Gulf Coast pretends to be almost a laboratory for how we really look at and think about poverty, which is my own selfish goal. But that certainly there is this bigger issue of poverty in America. And so first we're going to have Angela kind of make some observations about building public will and political will based on her experiences in the Gulf Coast and nationally. And then she's going to actually ask Gloria a couple of questions about how we grow and sustain political will from a communications perspective. And so I turn it over to you, ladies.
Well, thank you, Ashley, for providing the opportunity. Jody, you've done a wonderful job, and all who put this together. And Gloria, I'm so happy to have an opportunity to consult with you, because I will tell you, I am just at my wit's end on this issue of how to build public will and how to sustain the partnerships that have come around these issues of poverty. And I think there's no better way to talk about this issue than to start with the Gulf and to talk about the lessons from the Gulf. When PolicyLink became involved right after the storm, and we became involved in the Gulf, after just being devastated by what we saw and understanding that there was a moment for us to bring everything that we had learned over all of our individual and collective careers, and we put together 10 points to guide rebuilding in the Gulf, and that just got us right into the middle of things. And we have had a bird's eye view for the past almost 3 years, and we've learned a lot. One of the most important lessons, Gloria, was that America cares. America really cared that values that hadn't been tapped in a while really got tapped when people saw what was happening. That this whole notion that this is a land of opportunity, that opportunity ought to be broadly available, that we are not a place that in a caste system just locks people out. People were shocked and ashamed of what they saw, and it tapped the best of the American people. And that was something that we had to relearn. I think along the way we've learned that from time to time, but we had to relearn it and own it at that moment. No matter what we thought about what was happening in the country, nobody could question that the American people cared. The next thing that we learned is that after so many years of talking in negative terms about the government, as if we didn't need government, that Americans have expectations of their government. They may have been joining in the conversation, but when they saw a disaster, when they saw a need for the government to be fast, effective, efficient, caring, and competent, they were outraged when they didn't see that, which said to me that another lesson to be learned is that we have high expectations for our government. And again, this is a lesson that we have learned. I think that we learn this lesson every single day, and that is that race matters, and it continues to matter. And that no matter how much devastation we were seeing, there was no denying that the most vulnerable to the natural disaster and to the man-made disaster were those people of color who were living in the Gulf region, who we saw stranded on rooftops. And given the compassion and the caring on the part of the American people, the expectation that we had for government, and the realization that race continues to matter in America, we learned that the media doesn't know how to handle the issue. Here they had an extraordinary moment when they could talk about poverty and race, and after being hit like everybody else, the media then turned to the same old ways of talking about it: crime, corruption, disorganization. And when the public began to see the media tell the same old story, they retreated. They lost interest. They'd heard that story. And if this is all it is, then maybe there's nothing new here. Maybe my caring, maybe the insight I thought I had as a person in this country just really wasn't anything special. So those are the 4 lessons that we kind of walked away with. And what's so interesting about all of that is that it's not rocket science, this issue of dealing with poverty and inequality. We know what to do. I had the honor last year to serve as co-chair with Peter Edelman at Georgetown University Law School of the Center for American Progress Task Force on Poverty. And we had many wonderful people on it, including Steve Kess from Acorn and Alice Rivlin from Brookings and many other people whose names you would know if I could call them all at this moment. And what we came up with was 4 basic areas to focus on that make total sense. That if we want to deal with poverty in America, we need to promote decent work. That the way to get out of poverty is to have a good job with good wages. That we need to make sure that we are providing opportunity for all, making sure that the neighborhoods where people live are supporting neighborhoods, that people have access to higher education by expanding the Pell Grants, that we really are providing pathways for people to be able to get the supports that they need, opportunity for all. That we need economic security. We need to ensure economic security so that when people cannot work, they can live with dignity, whether that means unemployment insurance or other supports. And lastly, if we're talking about dealing with poverty, we need to build wealth. That, as the other panel said, it's not enough just to try to make people less uncomfortable in their poverty, but we have to build wealth. So given that we had this moment, and given that we know what to do, nobody was shocked by anything I just said. There were no real insights there. We know this stuff. What's the problem? And so one other thing I'll just add by way of background is that we had the pleasure of working with your company once before when last year, to focus on the 2nd anniversary of Katrina, we tried to launch a campaign called Hope Needs Help, where we could actually try to break through the 2 things that were going on. One is so much money's gone down there, the problem is solved, move on. Or so much money's gone down there, the problem's not solved, it can't be solved. And we were trying to say, but community-based organizations are doing extraordinary work, and individuals, the story of recovery in the Gulf has been the story of individuals and community organizations rising above everything to begin to rebuild their lives. That level of hope is really so palpable, but that hope needs help, and it needs help in the form of policy and support in order to go forward. And so I really want to turn to you and ask, given all that background, first, how do we begin to develop a new narrative that gets us into a different conversation? Because the victim narrative and the bootstrap narrative both lead to a dead end in terms of public policy. They don't take us into a public policy discussion. What's your comment?